class war. Now, it's always those who seek to build a more equal society, where the wealth collectively created by the hard work, the hard graft of tens of millions of people isn't sucked into the bank accounts of a tiny few. It's those people who always get accused of class war, of being class warriors. But you see, this has always been epic projection. Because if only Labour did actually fight on behalf of the majority of working class people, etc., with as much gusto and determination as the Tories fight on behalf of their wealthy benefactors, the big business and financial elites who are in power, whoever is in office. Now, whether it be smashing the trade unions who exist to give workers collective power so they can win a greater share of the wealth they create and have dignity and rights in the workplace, basic things you'd expect in a vaguely functioning democratic society. It'd be nice to have one of those, wouldn't it? Whether it be flogging off public assets to profiteers, whether it be handing the already thriving rich tax cuts or rolling back state support for those who are struggling while extending it to corporate interests. All of this is class warfare. So the latest Tory policy being cooked up shouldn't be a surprise in that context, shouldn't be a surprise. The latest news is that our Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is plotting real terms cuts to benefits to fund tax cuts which will disproportionately benefit the well-off. In practice, this means benefits won't be uprated, as is supposed to be standard practice, in line with inflation, which means in real terms they will fall in value, all amidst one of the worst squeezes in living standards in modern times. Now, what they'll do is they'll end up saying, just to preempt what's going to happen before the election, they'll say, oh, these tax cuts won't just go to rich people. But poorer Britons don't pay income tax. And the tax cuts will be regressive, that even if middle income Brits get a small tax cut, the richest will overwhelmingly save the most. This is straightforwardly, if it happens, redistributing money from the poor, from those who are struggling, to the rich. Now, the Tories are, let's just be clear, they are the political wing of the wealthy. In the first 2 years after the election, they received £11 million from hedge funds and financial tycoons. Now, this is important for me to state because for the last 7 years, what the Tories have tried to do is redefine themselves with a form of right-wing populism where they sought to portray themselves as the representatives, the tribunes of the people against the elites. And they did this by leveraging the nationalist wave which underpinned the Leave result back in the 2016 referendum. Now, actually, Brexit was pretty complicated. Most working class voters under 35 opted for Remain. Most middle class voters over 65 opted for Leave. It's often presented as working class people voted for Leave, middle class people voted for Remain. Far more complicated than that. But the academic research does suggest that areas most hurt by benefit cuts voted disproportionately for Leave, and that was enough to tip the result in favour of Brexit. Not a surprise. Many of those whose lives are so hard and tough offered a referendum which was interpreted as, are you happy with the status quo? And answered no. Now, in her notorious 2016 Citizens of Nowhere speech, Theresa May unapologetically raided the rhetoric of the left, promising to shift the balance of Britain decisively in favour of ordinary working class people. Now, what a political project really sought to do was redefine class politics, if you like. So, for us on the left, class politics is you champion the economic interests of workers against their profiteering bosses, that you try to secure for working people a greater slice of the wealth that they create in society. But for the right, for Theresa May, the Conservatives, the working class was redefined as a cultural concept, revolving around narrow nationalism, opposition to immigration and multiculturalism, and oppressed not by the boss class who fund the Conservatives, but by a supposedly progressive elite which has contempt for its own country and indeed are rootless citizens of nowhere. Now, as much as May now opportunistically seeks to whitewash her political record, Boris Johnson simply expanded on her strategy. That was pretty farcical, coming from an old Etonian who once wrote that blue-collar men are likely to be drunk, criminal, aimless, feckless, and hopeless. But the truth of this right-wing, fraudulent populism is exposed by the fact that Tories have always been, and always will be, class warriors in the service of those with too much money. That's why after the first decade of Tory rule, it was estimated that 1.5 million Britons were below the poverty line because of the benefit cuts they'd imposed since they came to power back in 2010. Now, according to poverty charities, basic benefits for struggling households are at least £140 a month less than the cost of life's essentials, things like food and energy and all the rest of it. Now, consider those who'll suffer the consequence of the Tories' latest assault on a welfare system stripped to the bone. 4 in 10 on universal credit are in work, because we have an economy, you see, defined by low pay and insecurity, and an unprecedented squeeze in living standards. To choose now to empty the pockets further of those struggling in order to raise cash for tax cuts for the well-off is class war at its basis. Now, I've spoken to many of those who'll be affected, and that includes people who Tory politicians applauded from their balconies and their porches during the pandemic, like the National Health Service, for example. I've even spoken to civil servants in the Department of Work and Pensions, which is in charge of the welfare state, who'll be themselves directly affected. Now, this comes on top of government proposals to slash benefits for those with long-term illnesses, such as mental health conditions. We discussed that on Jamie Vine show last week. Now, just listen to this caller and the response I made.
Michelle in Manchester. Good afternoon, Michelle. What would you like to say?
Hiya. My husband has been on sick, and we had to go in to see somebody for a back to work meeting. And the lady at the meeting considered that he was fit for work, which he's got a lot of problems with, and he obviously wasn't. And his anxiety from that meeting just literally went absolutely through the roof, because he felt he was made to feel like a disappointment, if you will. And the next day, and I really consider it was brought on from that meeting, he actually had a heart attack and died.
By the way, just so sorry to hear that.
Michelle, by the way, I'm devastated to hear, really devastated to hear that. And I this is the point I was making before, actually, a very shocking, extreme case of it, actually, which is if you put huge amounts of stress on people with severe mental health conditions, there can be disastrous consequences. In this case, a fatal case. Again, that's the problem. You have to offer people with mental health problems support. You've got to resource our mental health services, which are completely at breaking point. But unless you invest in support and emphasising support, if you focus on sanctions and conditionality, which however you spin it, that is central to the government's package, you risk cases like this.
Well, you see, this is the sort of human misery that this class war unleashes. You know, that's an extreme case, if you like, though not as extreme as it should be. Under George Osborne, hundreds and hundreds of people were found fit for work and then died. And we can talk about death as obviously the most horrific and extreme impact, but what about those suffering from acute conditions whose life is already difficult and hard, being put through the ringer by a Conservative government determined to empty their pockets in order to help shore up the incomes of those who already have too much money. Now, as I've said, this class war has many different fronts. The anti-trade union laws imposed by the Conservatives were intended to suffocate the ability of workers to stand up for themselves and secure a fair share of the wealth they create, and that itself has played a pivotal role in the unprecedented squeeze in living standards. But it's important to spell out how the class war works, because when the labour movement is accused of class war, it's simply a means of stigmatising workers standing up for themselves in order, as I keep saying, to secure a fair share of the wealth that they create, whilst those who supposedly abhor class war are the ones who fight it the hardest. And that's what this government has done, whilst dressing itself in the garbs of populism, that it stands up to the elite on behalf of the people. And that's what right-wing populism always leads to. It's simply a ruse to get people whose lives are hard to vote against their own interests, and for a politics which, in the end, will only benefit those at the top. And to spell that out, as the Resolution Foundation recently found, in this parliament, the incomes of working households are set to fall by 4%. That is unprecedented in living memory. That is where right-wing populism leads, not the emancipation of the people, being liberated from a supposed elite, which isn't the business and financial elite which the Conservatives represent, but a fictional elite which they've created. But what it's done is just redistribute more wealth and power to those who already have it, at the expense of the majority. That is the right-wing populism of the Conservatives, and it is class warfare. Please like, subscribe, please support us on patreon.com/OwenJones84 if you wish all of this to continue, and I will see you soon.